Thank you for joining us today for a 30,000-foot view of the open education landscape. The OER webinar today is going to be run by Nancy Henke, the Textbook Affordability Librarian at the University of Northern Colorado. We'll have time at the end of the webinar for questions, but if you are enjoying the recording, feel free to reach out to oer@dhe.state.co.us or directly to Nancy with any follow-up questions. And now I'll turn it over to you, Nancy.
Thanks, Chelsea. Hello, everybody. My name is Nancy Henke. As Chelsea said, I'm UNC's Textbook Affordability Librarian. So I will be talking about the 30,000-foot view of the open education landscape. So thank you for those of you who are able to join in real time, and hello to future people if you're watching the recording. I'm going to go ahead and start with just talking a bit about what am I going to be talking about today. So I'm going to start with a tiny bit of context, basically why I am approaching today's presentation the way I am. Then I'm going to jump into the beginning of the alphabet soup that comes along with this work. So ZTC, OER, LER, OA. So some of these initials, what they mean, how they relate to one another. And then I'm going to talk about a few more letters, ATB, IAEA, which is how publishers are responding with automatic textbook billing programs. Then I will talk about library roles in supporting zero textbook cost initiatives. And then we'll zoom out to the broader OER ecosystem and talk a little bit about some of the nonprofits doing this work. What are some of the platforms used to create OER? What are some of the repositories people use to deposit their OER? And then we'll close with questions, comments, thoughts. So please feel free to use the chat to wild abandon during my presentation, but I will warn you that while I have a long instruction background, and so I am not fazed at all by people actually raising their hand to ask a question while I am talking, I never was able to get down to being very good at watching the chat while I'm giving an online webinar. So my apologies there, but if you put a question in the chat, I can certainly address it at the end. I'm very happy to. Okay, so that's where we're going today. So I want to talk at the beginning a little bit about my why for this presentation and kind of my approach to it. So I began in open education when I was an LIS student. When I was earning my degree in library and information science, I did a practicum with the OER librarian at the institution where I was a student. And it was a nice intersection. My previous career was in higher education instruction for over a decade. And then I decided to become a librarian. So OER works very well with that. But I very quickly learned that there were a lot of players in this space, and sorting out who was doing what and how and what terms meant and how they related to each other, it took some time to really kind of tease all that out. So what I decided when Chelsea talked about doing a librarian series for the OER Council, I thought that, like, I'm imagining myself, my platonic ideal audience is me as a last semester, almost ready to graduate library student who wants to go into this work and is kind of teasing out and understanding how all these things relate to one another. But even if you are not the platonic ideal, because so few people are, the audience member, I am hoping that you'll learn something, get some understanding about the way people talk, the terms they use, and the different organizations that are doing this work and kind of how they overlap with one another. Okay, so another thing I want to talk about is what this presentation is and what it is not. So what this presentation is, okay, very simply, it's that big, broad, high-level view of open education. So I gave you my agenda. You obviously signed up. You read the abstract for the webinar. But I want to tell you, sometimes it's helpful to understand something by understanding what it is not. So this presentation is not an overview of why we love OER. There are many reasons to love OER. I love OER. But that's a different webinar. In fact, that's a different series of webinars. So, I'm not going to get into all the many reasons beyond cost savings why OER are fantastic. It is also not an exhaustive, granular view of everything that's being done in this space. Okay, so I guarantee you, there are undoubtedly organizations, nonprofits, advocacy groups that are doing great work in this space who I don't mention. And that's not because they're not great, and it's not because they're not impactful. It's simply that by the nature of this presentation, it is broad and not deep. Okay, so if you're in your brain, you're like, oh, but what about XYZ? It's not because I don't think they're fantastic. It's probably because maybe I don't know about them, or I'm just trying to give you a sampling of some of the work that's going on in this space. Okay. Also, one kind of warning is that there are probably, especially when I talk about different organizations, there are probably some organizations that I describe one way and they would describe themselves differently. So for instance, I might describe something as a repository. And that's my viewpoint as a librarian, is that they are a repository. They might describe themselves differently, like, oh, well, we prefer to call ourselves a creation platform with an extensive library of resources. It's like, cool. I'm not going to tell you how to define yourself, but I'm just trying to explain like how I see certain organizations in my role as a librarian here. And finally, this is not an ad for UNC. Although I'm very proud of all the things that we are doing, I do have a number of UNC examples, but that is not because there's not other fantastic work going on. It's simply because it's my context. So I have incorporated non-UNC examples, but a number of times when I talk about something that's going on, I'm obviously going to pull from the University of Northern Colorado's activities, since that's what I do. So I am very proud of what we're doing, but it is definitely not the only good work going on in this space in Colorado. Okay, so let's go ahead and begin. We're going to start with the alphabet soup. ZTC, OER, LAR, OA, and more, a multi-pronged approach to affordability. So what I've done to try to establish kind of the relationship between these terms is I've created this Venn diagram, and I will come back to it throughout this first part of the presentation, and I'm going to delve into each of these more deeply in future slides. But really, the way that I kind of have come to understand this is that ZTC, zero textbook cost, is the goal of bringing students' course materials down to zero. But there are many ways to do that. And they don't have to be just one, they can be overlapping. So here are some of the many ways that those textbook costs can be brought down to zero. You can use OER, Open Educational Resources. You can use LER, Library Licensed Educational Resources. You can use OA, which is open access content. You can use authoritative free-to-use web content. And you can use kind of this catch-all of other zero-cost materials. So I'm going to go through each of these, and I'm going to return to this to kind of help show that in the big circle of ZTC, there's lots of smaller circles that are a way to achieve that goal. Okay, and then we'll also hit low-cost materials before we close. So I'm going to start with the bread and butter, right? This is for the CDHE OER Council. OER, Open Educational Resources. So we probably have OER fans. So the basics of OER hopefully are known to you, but I'm still going to define them because I think it's important to establish terms. So OER are no-cost learning resources that are in the public domain or carry an open license that allow for the 5R activities: retain, revise, reuse, remix, redistribute. Now, that's, if you are new to OER, that definition needs some unpacking. So, of course, one of the major draws of OER is that they are no cost. Okay, they are no cost to anyone. You don't have to pay for them. Okay, but the other thing that's very important is they are either in the public domain, meaning they belong to everyone. Nobody has the copyright because there's no longer copyright attached to them, or they have an open license that specifically allows for those 5 activities. Now, the open licenses are very important because just because something is free and online does not mean it's OER. Free online resources can be fantastic, and I will talk about them on a different slide. But just because something is free and online does not make it OER. OER are either in the public domain or have the open license. So public domain materials can be used in any way by anyone. Open licenses are attached to something that still is under copyright, but they tell a user what they're allowed to do with those materials. And so I have the Creative Commons logo here because Creative Commons is not the only open license, but it is definitely by far the most common that I will see in my role. There are different licenses, open licenses you can attach. And Creative Commons, one of their kind of taglines is some rights reserved. Because in the United States, copyright is given to a creator automatically upon the creation of something. When they put an idea into kind of a tangible form, you do not have to register it with the Copyright Office in order to have the copyright. And you automatically get all rights reserved to you, the creator who hold that copyright. Everything belongs to you, even if you don't want all of those rights, even if you want other people to be able to do things with it. And that's where Creative Commons licenses come in. So the Creative Commons license gives people information in the license about what they're allowed to do with it. And so OER have a license that says you can revise, you can remix, you can change it. And that's a really important part of OER. Another thing I like to remind people or help people understand is that attaching an open license to something does not mean the author gives up their copyright. Far from it. If you dedicate something to the public domain, if you choose to do that, then you're giving up your copyright. But if you just attach an open license to it, what you're doing is simply using the license to communicate what rights you're giving to the others and like what you're keeping for themselves, what you're keeping for yourself as an author. So now I'm not going to get too into the weeds with Creative Commons licenses. Again, that's its own webinar, but open licenses for OER are very important because they help distinguish it from other things. And then they open the doors to be able to do things that you can't do with other learning resources that don't have the open license, namely that revision, right? The adaptation to a specific class or a specific group of students. Okay, so OER are one of the prongs in ZTC, right? One of the ways that we achieve zero textbook cost could be through OER. We might also do LER, library licensed educational resources. Now, LER, I always use the term library licensed educational resources. Sometimes I have seen this just simply as library educational resources. And once in a great while, I have seen library enabled resources. But mostly I use the term library licensed resources. So LER are learning resources paid for by a library, and they're then openly available to that library's community through user authentication. So simply user authentication, obviously logging into your library system to access an article or an ebook or something like that. Now, library licensed resources are zero cost to students. So they have been paid for by the library, but the students can access them for free. Or another way of thinking about LER is that the students have already paid for these by virtue of being students at the institution, because they are students, because they have paid their tuition in whatever way that is, and they have, access to university resources. They have already paid for these. So LER are zero cost to students, and they tend to have traditional all rights reserved copyright. So in that sense, you can use it, you can learn from it, they're fantastic, but you can't revise them. So my example for this is this image on the left of this page, which is the cover of a book called Tunes for Tunes by Daniel Goldmark. This is what I call a librarian win. And by that, I mean, this book had been required to be purchased in a class at my institution. There is a music for cartoons class in our music school. The instructor had this book, required students purchase it. I was doing some research, looking at our textbooks, our bookstore's website, and I said, Tunes for Tunes, that's interesting. I'll look to see if we have anything similar in our collection. And lo and behold, the exact same book, same publication year, same edition, everything completely free to students because it was in one of our library databases that we subscribe to as an ebook, and it had completely unlimited licenses, which means as many students as possible could access this textbook at the same time. And that's really powerful because basically what I was able to do is contact that instructor and say, you're asking students to pay for this $40 book. Guess what? If they use this link to the library's website, right, they are able to access this ebook for free. Okay, so LER, library licensed resources, are really powerful. Another way to achieve ZTC. Okay, so then that jumps us to OA, open access. So OA tends to refer to journal articles and books that are free and online, but they cannot be adapted or redistributed. Now, the specifics of what you can do depends on the specific license, but I'm going to talk about kind of a representative example of an open access book. I found this textbook in the directory of open access books, and I have put an excerpt here from the front matter. And this includes, you'll notice that it has the copyright, right? The people who wrote the book still have the copyright, but they attached an open license to it. And in this case, they chose Creative Commons Attribution, Non-Commercial, No Derivatives license, which is described here. But really what this means, the ND, no derivatives, is pretty common in something like an open access book, which means you can't fiddle with it, right? Remember, OER had the license that allow you to revise it. Open access tends to be things that are openly available. You can use and read them for free, but you can't change the content as you would with OER. Okay, so open access, usually they cannot be adapted or redistributed. Okay, so that's OA, open access. So let's go to another kind of part of this way to achieve ZTC, zero textbook cost, authoritative free-to-use web content. So authoritative free-to-use web content is very simply free online materials an instructor has deemed high quality, right, and accurate. And they usually have all rights reserved copyright. So instructors use these in classes a lot. And so one of millions of examples I could have pulled is PBS Frontline documentaries. They're free, they're online. If a subject matter expert, an instructor in a class, has deemed the quality high enough, accurate for what they want to teach, they can point students to this website. Please watch this documentary. Please learn from it. And there we go. We have a learning resource that's free, but it's under copyright, right? They can't be adjusted. They can't be edited like an OER can. So authoritative free-to-use web content is used in classes a lot, right? It's used in classes all the time. But again, that copyright status is all rights reserved. It doesn't have the open license attached to it, as you might see in OER or OA. Okay. Then we have our nice catch-all, other zero-cost materials. Okay, so other zero-cost materials are just this final catch-all category of other ways that you can achieve the goal of ZTC. So this might be instructor-created materials. Plenty of instructors already create their own slide decks, study guides, worksheets to help a student kind of think through steps in a process or something like that. And those are learning materials, instructor has created them. They're obviously deeming them high quality, that are one of the other ways to achieve zero textbook costs. So things the instructor creates and just shares with their students. But we also have student created materials. That is another way, right? And this might be related to another term that is a little outside the scope of this presentation, but open pedagogy is about involving students in the creation of course materials, and student created materials can be high quality learning resources as well. So for instance, one of the instructors at my institution every semester has students for the big final exam. She puts them into groups, gives them specific concepts, and they create study guides for those concepts. Then they share all their study guides with their peers. And then suddenly the students have this great study guide created by them and their peers, all the topics they need to know for the final exam, fantastic learning resource created by students. Okay. And then finally, the last kind of other zero cost materials, my catch-all, is copyrighted materials used under the fair use exception and US copyright law. Now, again, fair use is the ins and outs of fair use is beyond the scope of this presentation. It's its own webinar, or again, a series of webinars. But people who are involved in educational work often have at least a basic understanding that items that have copyright in certain contexts with certain amounts used for certain lengths of time, it's okay to use them in specific ways in an educational context. So copyrighted materials that are used within the bounds of fair use is another way to achieve ZTC, zero textbook cost. Okay, so we have all the ways you can achieve ZTC: OER, LER, OA, authoritative free to use web content, and other zero cost materials. But you'll notice that if ZTC is the planet, you got low cost materials over here, they're the moon. It's in the orbit, it's hanging out, but technically it's not zero textbook cost, but it's low cost. So low cost materials, how you define low cost can actually vary widely. So sometimes that definition is determined by an institution. They determine at our institution, low cost means this dollar amount. But it could also be a state can do it, a consortium can do it. Sometimes, interestingly enough, what low cost means is actually tied to the minimum wage in a specific area. And if you, like me, find this fascinating, I have linked threads from two threads, one from 2022 and one from just actually a couple weeks ago on the Spark Open Education Forum. It's a major listserv in open education. And a lot of different professionals in this field kind of weighed in on what low cost means at their institution and how they determined that. But generally speaking, I will say that low cost tends to mean less than $50 for all the materials for that, for all the learning materials for that course. So at UNC, for instance, ours is $20. So we have determined that at our institution, $20 is what low cost means, but that actually might be different at other institutions. Okay, so here we go. Okay, so we're back to this. So we have all of our alphabet soup. And am I done with the initials? No, I'm not, because one thing you may have heard of, but maybe don't know much about or are wondering where it is on my Venn diagram, is something called IA, which stands for inclusive access, or EA, which stands for equitable access. And so those are actually different. They are not on here for a very important reason, because those are actually in some ways commercial responses to high textbook costs. And what they do is really in my circles, we tend to just call these automatic textbook billing programs, because really what they are is they're sales models from publishing companies for digital course materials. So I'll talk a little bit about the differences between IA and EA, inclusive access and equitable access. But broadly speaking, in both of these cases, the cost of digital course materials is added to students' tuition and fees. Prices of these materials are set by publishers, and the materials generally have the all rights reserved copyright. I say generally because obviously I don't know every single textbook ever, but I'm going to go out on a limb and say probably all of them have all rights reserved copyright, right? Because they're traditional textbooks, they're digital textbooks, but they're traditional textbooks in the sense created by a traditional publishing company, sold to institutions. Okay, so inclusive versus equitable access. Inclusive access is a course by course model. So in these specific cases, the digital content, so the digital learning materials for the courses that are kind of taking part, or the courses that have an inclusive access textbook, all of that is delivered through the LMS. So through Canvas or Moodle or D2L or whatever it is. And so students enrolled in the class, as soon as they get their Canvas account, log in, the course materials are there. And then students have a specific opt-out period where they can choose to opt out of purchasing those digital materials that are in the LMS. And if they choose not to opt out, then they are automatically billed for those to their student accounts. So the names for the programs can vary. Different institutions can kind of rebrand them. I've put some of the many that maybe you've heard of that are kind of floating around inclusive access programs. Equitable access programs are different, and this is a flat fee model. So in EA, equitable access, students are charged a fixed fee based on the number of credit hours they take. So however many credits you're enrolled in, you get a flat fee per credit hour. And the fee is the same for every student, regardless of the exact cost of the materials of the courses they are taking. So in an extreme example, but is a real example because it could really happen, a student who's enrolled in 12 credits of all ZTC courses, so they have 4 classes that have no textbook costs, they actually will pay the same as a student who is enrolled in 12 credits of upper division STEM courses with really costly materials. So that works out really great for the STEM student, but it works out a lot less great for the student who otherwise would be paying nothing. So inclusive access, equitable access. So you can see they're not actually in ZTC. They're not part of kind of bringing textbook costs down to zero because there are costs associated with them, right? You're buying a digital textbook. So this chart was created by the state OER Council, the Colorado OER Council, a few years ago. And so kind of thinking about how automatic textbook billing compares with OER, you'll see. So OER on the far right column, OER are free, right? And also OER, because of their open licenses, are adaptable, right? So there's a lot of differences between them. So in some ways, this is really a commercial response to high textbook costs that sometimes people collapse in with some of these other initials, IA, EA, ZTC, but they're actually different, right? They're not part of the ZTC because they have textbook costs. Okay, so now I promise the alphabet soup is gone. So let's shift gears. Now that we've talked about all the different ways that we might achieve zero textbook cost, and a little bit about low-cost materials, I want to talk about library support, right? Remember, my platonic ideal for this presentation is myself in my last semester of my LIS program. So how are libraries taking part in this? What are libraries doing? So first, how libraries support OER. So one of the things libraries might do is curate collections of OER that already exist specific to their institution. So I've linked some examples here. I have put one together for UNC. My screenshot here is from the LA Valley College Library. I have one from Canada. But this image that we have here is an example of what you might see, is that somebody pulled together different OER for these different subject areas, put them in a nice LibGuide, and then can point faculty members who might be interested in OER to these resources. Now, who does this in the library can vary by institution. So it depends on an institution's size, their model. So if for instance, at UNC, I am the textbook affordability librarian, I created our no-cost materials guide. But some libraries have different models. So it could be that if the library has a liaison model where they have people who are kind of assigned to specific departments to be the kind of expert in materials for that, they might help find OER. The education librarian finds education-related OER. And it can also be a blended model. Maybe it's a collaboration among a lot of people. Okay, so that's one way that libraries support OER is curating collections, digging through repositories, finding things, and putting them together in a way that helps faculty understand what their options are. Another way that we support OER, conducting outreach and publicizing opportunities. And these opportunities might be for professional development activities that are related to OER, whether local or statewide or national. We might help run grants. Thanks, CDHE. Events, we might research OER/ZTC options for faculty for specific courses. And my image on the right-hand side is one of many pieces of publicity that I did when I was soliciting faculty to apply for our mini grant program. So I did a whole lot of different publicity activities. This is one of many, and really trying to help people understand that we have these grants available, there's support, please please learn more. And then who might be reached out to, who might be contacted to learn about these things, again, can vary based on the institution. A librarian might reach out to individual instructors that they know, they have relationships with, who might be interested in this, who are interested in OER. They might reach out to specific departments, showing, hey, did you realize that accounting actually has a lot of different OER available? Have you thought about using OER in any of your courses? At the college level, right? I was able to meet with the leadership of all the colleges at UNC a couple of years ago and let them know, right? These are the things that we do. Please help us spread the word. Institutional leadership, the provost, the finance team. Those are some of the people I've reached out to and being able to meet with. And that's part of my work, right? It's how I'm supporting OER, is helping be in contact with people in the university to help them understand what we do and its impact. And one thing too that we've done at UNC that I'm really happy with is we've actually done a lot of specific outreach to new faculty. We work with our teaching and learning center, we get lists of new faculty, and we actually go set up times to meet with them, bring them a little goodie bag, and help them know from the beginning of their time at our institution what this is. They should be on the lookout for these opportunities. We want them to know who we are and what we do. So that's another way that libraries support OER. A third way is collaborating with faculty. This is a nice catch-all term. So that might be those consultations. A faculty member comes to me and says, I'm interested in OER for this specific class, but I don't even know where to start. Where do I look? And I could have a consultation with them in the same way I might have a research consultation with a student. Librarians and libraries also support in-process and completed OER projects. And that's where my slide on my image on the right comes in. So this is an organization kind of housed within UNC, Cooler, their community collaboration and learning for climate resilience. They actually did a project where they were had a lot of different faculty creating OER about climate education. And as they've been going through that process, I, as the OER librarian, have been providing a lot of support, answering questions, helping them understand what they can and can't do with certain types of content so that they can create OER, and then we can spread that word out to others. Other ways, collaborating with faculty, general education about OER ZTC. I also answer a lot of copyright and licensing questions. So copyright and licensing knowledge comes in very handy in this world, as it does with other aspects of library work, and even facilitating uploads to repositories. So somebody has created something, they put an open license on it. Where should we put it? How are we going to make it discoverable? How are we going to make sure that people know that this amazing thing that you created exists? And if it's useful to them, how do they find it, right? Again, the same way that libraries support discoverability of all sorts of other materials that they have in their collection. Okay. And then another way we support OER, we do a lot, publishing and hosting OER that are created by faculty members. Now, how much OER publishing happens can completely depend on the institution's capacity and staffing, right? Its size. So some academic libraries have really robust OER publishing programs, and I put links to a couple. Some big libraries have multiple people on their OER team, and they have somebody who's the OER publishing librarian, and they can have a project manager, and it's amazing, and they create great stuff. But that does not represent every institution. Some have much smaller but impactful programs. UNC's OER publishing is small but mighty. We don't create a lot of OER, but we do have these healthy collections of open course materials and open textbooks. And in fact, this screenshot on the left is the most popular items from our repository based on the average number of full text downloads since the day it was posted. And 2 of the top 10 are actually OER. And so of the thousands and thousands and thousands of things in our repository, 2 of the top 10 are OER created by our faculty. So small but mighty still has an impact. You don't have to be part of the SUNY system to actually have high quality OER that you're creating. And finally, my last way how libraries support OER, they might administer OER grant programs. So this is a screenshot from last year's grantees. And a lot of librarians might be the PI or the co-PI on some of these grants. Now, it doesn't have to come from a library, right? So the PI could be a faculty member, or it could be someone in a teaching and learning center, right? There could be teams, but a number of librarians, right, have helped get, these general incentive grants for their institution and help run these programs. So libraries do a lot to support OER, but we also do support other ZTC options. So LER support, this is identifying relevant no-cost resources within the library's licensed content. So digging into those databases, seeing if there are ebooks that might work for a faculty member's class, and helping them understand that this is also an option, right? These e-resources that are available through the library's databases. But also this comes with checking on license limitations, because not every book that is an ebook in a database has unlimited licenses. So if you only have 1 license for an ebook, that means 1 person can access that ebook at a time. That is not going to work for a class. So, and unfortunately, we've had people not take a look at that and try, and it's not going to work out great. So advising on how many licenses are available, and if there aren't that many licenses, maybe we can check on pricing. Maybe we can afford more licenses. It just depends on the vendor and the contract and the budget and all that. But it's a way of advocating for faculty, right? And helping them understand these options and see if we can help them. Also, educating about course reserves and e-reserves. Those are other ways that you can use library resources. This would count under the catch-all of copyrighted materials used under fair use. So course reserves and e-reserves are fantastic options. If you only want a chapter of this book, put it on e-reserve, and then you have an e-reserve used within the bounds of fair use that could be used in a class. And then promoting these LER options to faculty, right? Helping them understand, like, hey, did you know this textbook that you're requiring your students for your music for cartoons class, we actually have for free through our databases. That's part of how we support it as well. And then again, catch-all other no-cost material support. We might help faculty in locating appropriate open access content, that high quality web content if they want help with that, items in the collection that can be used within the bounds of fair use and perhaps put on course reserve or e-reserve, helping people understand what license terms mean on OA content, and advising on copyright and fair use for those items that do have kind of the traditional all rights reserved copyright. How might you help them understand to help them do a fair use test, to help them understand what that might mean? Okay, so, oh my gosh, there's so many ways that libraries are supporting this work. So let's zoom out though, because I do want to talk about the different organizations that are doing work in this space. So I have what's called an incomplete, but hopefully still helpful look at the open education ecosystem. And I'm going to go through, if you can't tell, I learned by Venn diagrams help me learn things, right? The relationships between things. So I created another Venn diagram. And I'm going to go through each part of this and kind of zoom in. But each time we'll come back to the main one so you can kind of see the whole thing again. So we're going to start with this nice broad term of organizations. So organizations. So this is where I put nonprofits, advocacy groups, etc., that are doing work in this space. And again, remember, broad, not deep. There are definitely organizations that are not in my list here. But some of the many that are taking part in this space, Spark does a lot in this space. So Spark is an open access and open education, open data, open science advocacy group. They do policy, they do education, and so they even host the National Open Education Conference that's coming up next month. And so Spark, very important in this space. But we also have OE Global, so Open Education Global, OE Global. They certainly operate in the US and Canada, but they also have a large presence in other parts of the world, which makes their focus is global, hence their name. But what's also interesting is that CCC OER, the Community College Consortium for OER, which runs one of the big listservs in this space, so it's a name that I see quite a lot. They're part of OE Global, so they're kind of nested within OE Global. And even the Open Education Network, that's hosted from the University of Minnesota. So they do a lot of education and certificate programs and trying to help spread the word and train librarians and train people in open pedagogy and open education. So we have organizations kind of doing work in this space. And so then let's jump from organizations to tools, platforms, and infrastructure. So tools, platforms, and infrastructure. First, you'll notice the overlap is Creative Commons. Okay, because Creative Commons is its own organization and they do education about all these different things, but they're also infrastructure big time because Creative Commons licenses are infrastructure that works within copyright law that basically allows for open education, like OER activities to happen. It's because of those open licenses that allow for derivatives such as Creative Commons licenses that allow the revisions to happen, which is what makes so much of the open education work possible. So they are both an organization that does education and things, but they are also definitely important infrastructure in making this work. Some other examples of tools or platforms, Pressbooks, Manifold, LibreText, again, there are others, but these are a few examples of platforms that help people take their great ideas for a textbook, for instance, some learning resources, and put them into a format that then can be easily understood and digested, basically creating versions of ebooks, right, that students can learn from, that people can learn from. Okay, so those OER, right, that are created, like somebody has a great idea, they make a press book, let's say, they attach a Creative Commons license to it, then they can be put into a repository. Okay, so repositories and referatories. Okay, so a lot of times, honestly, these terms are collapsed. Repository and referatory, technically they're different, and this is a very librarian-y distinction, but technically a repository hosts and holds on to something, and a referatory links out to it. Again, I don't know if people outside of the library world would even notice that distinction, but technically they're different. So what you'll notice in the overlap is one of the things that I put in the overlap between platforms and repositories is OER Commons, because OER Commons is a fantastic repository. They hold a lot of OER. It's one of my go-tos. But you can actually also create OER within OER Commons because they have a creation tool, a creation feature. So they're kind of stuck in the middle between the platforms and the repositories. Okay. You'll also notice that the Open Textbook Library, which is from the Open Education Network, is on this cusp between organizations and repositories, right? Because they host this library of open textbooks. And then you get something like Pressbooks Directory and LibreText Commons. And again, those were creation platforms, which you can use to create them. But once something is created, it can go into the Pressbooks Directory. And then there are so many Pressbooks that have been created, essentially becomes its own little library, right? Its own repository, same way with LibreText. And then there are so many other different repositories. This is not even close to the number of repositories that I could talk about. But you'll notice also at the end, institutional repositories. So those are repositories that are housed at an academic institution, generally an academic institution. And we talked about how libraries are ultimately helping become OER publishers. Well, where do they put those OER when they're created, right? Maybe they use Pressbooks, create an OER with the help of libraries, right? And then you can put it in an institutional repository in addition to putting it in other repositories. So institutional repositories hold a lot of really good materials as well. So this is where we can see kind of the overlap. This stuff gets complicated. Okay, so we've done that. Let's go ahead and jump to OER publishers. Now, OER publishers, we've already talked about academic libraries. Academic libraries support a lot of OER publishing. Certainly not all, but a lot of it. But there are other actors in this space as well. So you may have heard of Lumen Learning. OpenStax is a nonprofit, sort of a gold standard in the OER world. They create a lot of fantastic OER especially for kind of lower division type core courses. But also individuals can be their own OER publisher without the help of an academic library, right? An individual could have a Manifold account and create an OER and use it in their class and publish it and have it in repositories, right? So they might be, an individual might be their own publisher. Okay, so then we go back to the big picture, and then there we get state and regional OER advocacy. And there we go, Colorado Department of Higher Education OER Council is one example of many. So at the state level, different consortia, different regions, there's a lot. And again, not exhaustive list, but there's a lot of good work happening in different states and in different regions. And in fact, if I could create this Venn diagram specifically for what I know the CDHE OER Council does, honestly, they kind of be in the center because they would be helping facilitate access to Creative Commons courses. They help with Pressbook licenses, right? They have a hub in OER Commons. So this is again where it gets complicated. So I couldn't necessarily that all of these places do that, but CDHE OER Council I know would kind of be in the center of this because they're helping with the education and pointing people in all these directions that help them learn more about this. So, woo, there's a lot there. Okay, so the quiz is in 2 minutes. Memorize it. No, just kidding, of course. So there's a lot happening in this space, and it gets complicated, but that's actually part of why I like it. I really like that it's so complicated that I need a Venn diagram. I actually like that there are so many organizations involved that I can't even put them all on my Venn diagram, because that is one thing that I think differentiates OER, the open education movement, from kind of traditional publishing, where there could be, 5 big publishers and a couple smaller ones, and it's messy in the best way, right? Because it's distributed, because there are a lot of actors in this space. So I like to think about its complication as one of its strengths, not one of its weaknesses. So let's recap. Looking back, what have we covered today? I've done the alphabet soup. ZTC, zero textbook cost. OER, open educational resources. LER, library license educational resources. OA, right? As well as some of the other kind of ways you get to zero textbook cost. And then also automatic textbook billing, the inclusive access, equitable access, which sometimes people in their mind collapse with what we're doing with ZTC, but are not the same. How libraries support these, each of these roles in the ZTC model, and then also the broader OER ecosystem. But what's looking ahead? And by that, I mean, what are some other things worth learning about? I mentioned a couple times that this webinar could not possibly go into the nuances of open licenses and fair use. I mean, there's just too much. So what are some other things that if you're interested in this space that are worth learning about? Open pedagogy is worth learning about. That's having students help create course materials. Open access publishing, kind of in the scholarly communication realm. Open access journal articles and open access books. A lot of interesting things happening there. Open science and open data initiatives. So scientific research and having that data openly available so that more people beyond the people who did the research can use that data. Licenses, so such as Creative Commons licenses. There's policy issues happening in the state, in regions, and nationally. AI and OER creation is talked about a lot right now, as well as AI and other aspects of open education. Accessibility is, of course, very important, and all things need to be accessible. OER can be accessible kind of from the get-go in ways that other materials might not be able to. And fair use, right? Copyright and fair use are items that are worth learning about more if you're interested in this space. So that gets us to questions, comments, thoughts. I'm going to go ahead. I have my email there. And if you want to connect with me on LinkedIn, I'm very happy to do so. I am interested in what questions people might have. So I should probably check the chat. Let's see. Individual course. Okay, excellent. OpenStax. Yep. Are there any questions or thoughts that people have that they want to share, whether either by verbally or in the chat?
Perhaps too comprehensive, Nancy. And
Maybe I
there's
should
not a
have left some
question yet.
holes.
It was a fantastic overview. I'm so excited to have all the the overlapping charts and the visualizations, and it's not just up in my head, like that we can see it. It was fabulous. But
Thanks.
yeah, if anyone has a question, let's hear it, or maybe you want advice about something.
Yeah. Okay,
Okay, we got a question in the chat.
how do you prevent ending up with OER databases with lots and lots of materials, but all varying in quality? What role could a library have in that? Yeah, that's an interesting question, because so first, I think one thing that's worth in my role as a librarian, one thing I actually talk about when I actually talk about quality is, are we actually talking about the content, the quality of the educational content, or is the person actually mixing quality of the content with layout and formatting and graphics and things like that? Because that can sometimes happen because commercial textbooks have graphic designers and beautiful layout, and an OER could be created with a Google Doc. Now, that wasn't in my platforms list, but you could actually create OER with Google Docs or Microsoft Word or PowerPoint and put open licenses on them. So first, I always make sure, just like, okay, are we actually talking about the quality of the content? And then the second thing is that one thing that in my specific role, there's no way that I can be a subject matter expert in every single discipline at my institution. Obviously, there's not. So one of the things that I let faculty know is that as the subject matter expert, in some ways, in the end, they are going to have to be able to review this material for it. However, there are things I can do as a librarian to help with that process, which is when I'm curating collections, I can vet things with I can look for OER publishers that I know are high quality. I can look to see if it came from an academic institution. I can look to see in the front matter if they had peer reviewers for their resource. So I can do other kind of librarian-y things that maybe help filter some of that out before I pass it along to a faculty member who is the subject matter expert. Would you and how do you gather data about commercial cost? And would you use that data to really target lecturers for specific courses with high commercial textbook costs? So great, fantastic question. And it's a very difficult question to answer, to be honest, because how do you gather data about commercial costs? So I'm going to talk about my institution, okay? But the problems that I have at my institution and what I run into is not just at my institution. So we have access to information from our bookstore about what faculty have ordered. So if the faculty say, I'm using this specific textbook, they report that to the bookstore. The bookstore, goes to vendors and finds what they need and gives students options for rental and purchase and hard copy and et cetera. And it's in the textbook system. And that actually connects with other university systems, which means if I want to find information about textbook costs, I can go to our Office of Institutional Research, work with somebody there, open a ticket, ask my questions, have a consultation, and they can kind of pull some of that data for me. So like, what are some of the range of costs? The reason that I say that we run into problems is that part of this is, again, not my institution, this is broadly speaking, determining how much somebody would pay for a textbook is difficult, because You have information from the bookstore, which is of course good information, is a good start. But one, you have different options from the bookstore, the rental, the digital, the hard copy, the used copy, okay? Then you also have the fact that some people, plenty of people, don't actually buy from the bookstore. They go to secondary markets. They go to Amazon. They go to eBay. They go to all these other places to buy used textbooks. So to really identify how much somebody actually, like what would be the average cost, is actually very difficult. And that's something I know that Chelsea works with a lot of the time, right? Trying to gather data. But we do have what we can pull from our textbook, from our bookstore. And would you use that data to really target lectures for specific courses with high commercial textbook cost? Yes, absolutely. Now, I wouldn't do it personally. I would not do it without at first starting some other conversation first. I would want to meet with that department. I would want to have presented to their curriculum committee. I would have wanted to have some sort of relationship with them, maybe seen them a webinar, just so that I can start with something. But yes, people are like saying, is like, hey, once I have that relationship, going, it's just like, I noticed that you actually have this, high textbook cost. Have you ever considered OER? Or no textbook cost? Is there, like, I'd be happy to research options if it's something you want to talk more about, and really leave and open it with that, because we do value academic freedom. Academic freedom. We want faculty to choose the course materials that they believe are right for their course, their students, et cetera. And that is actually very important to us. But if my goal a lot of times is if we can begin to bring the no cost into the thought process and make headway that way, and help people understand how much they could be saving students and what these other benefits are that come from using open educational resources because of their adaptability, then I can kind of begin those conversations. You're welcome. Are there any other questions or thoughts people have? Okay, well, I'm so glad that I had this opportunity today. Thank you everyone who joined in real time. Thank you anyone who watched the full recording. And I'll let Chelsea close it all up.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Nancy. That you were a fantastic speaker. If anyone is interested in the resources that CDHE's OER Council offers that Nancy mentioned, like Creative Commons certificate trainings, our conference, and other PD webinars, please feel free to reach out at oer@dhg.state.co.us. But if you are in Colorado, we would love to be able to support your professional development related to OER. Fortunately, I cannot offer it outside of the state, but thank you to anyone who is watching the recording wherever you are.
And there's a final question about SlideShare. So just so that people know, what's going to happen is that Chelsea's going to send me the recording of the video. I'm going to make sure the transcript is correct so we have accessibility. I'm going to create a record in our institutional repository, the state of Colorado, the University of Northern Colorado. It'll have the slides, it'll have the recording, and then I'll share that back to Chelsea so she can share it with anyone who is registered today, and it will go into our repository and will eventually be in the Colorado Higher Ed Hub of OER Commons. So that's linking a bunch of stuff I just said about academic libraries and institutional repositories and state advocacy, right? Bringing a bunch of stuff together. All right. Thank you all very much. I appreciate it.